The diner was almost entirely empty when Emily wiped down the worn laminate counter, an immense, suffocating exhaustion weighing heavily upon her slender shoulders. She had received pitifully few tips throughout her grueling shift, and the rent for her tiny apartment was due in exactly 2 days. Outside, the harsh winds of Chicago howled against the frosted glass, a constant reminder of the bitter cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Suddenly, the heavy glass door swung open with a resounding thud, and an elegantly dressed man stepped into the warm, grease-scented air of the diner. His presence was immediately commanding, shifting the entire atmosphere of the quiet room. His tailored wool coat and perfectly fitted suit were undoubtedly worth more than her entire yearly salary combined. As she nervously handed him his bill for a simple black coffee, the man's sleek leather wallet fell open, and tucked inside was a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of her mother. Emily's heart completely stopped in her chest. With a trembling hand, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, asking him why he possessed a photograph of her mother in his wallet. Emily gasped for air, her lungs constricting as she stared intently at the familiar, loving face, tucked away inside the billionaire's elegant leather accessory. Her mother's warm, gentle smile looked back at her, perfectly frozen in time, a ghost from a past she thought she completely understood. It was absolutely impossible. Her mother had never once mentioned knowing anyone remotely this wealthy, let alone a man who carried himself with such intimidating authority. And yet, right here on the sticky diner counter was undeniable proof that they were somehow deeply connected. The man, seemingly oblivious to her violent internal reaction, calmly took his wallet back, placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter, and stood up to leave the establishment. A blinding panic washed over Emily's entire body. She absolutely could not let him just walk away into the dark night. She managed to choke out an apology, her voice shaking violently, barely a whisper in the quiet diner. The tall man paused, turning his piercing gaze directly upon her. His cold blue eyes were sharp and entirely impenetrable, sending a terrifying shiver cascading down her spine. He asked her what she wanted, his tone utterly indifferent, acting as though he had already forgotten her existence. Emily swallowed hard, her throat feeling like sandpaper, tightly clenching her hands into fists at her sides, to stop them from shaking. She told him that the photograph in his wallet was of her mother, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. For the very first time, a microscopic flicker of genuine emotion crossed the billionaire's stoic face. It was a brief moment of intense hesitation, a barely noticeable shift in his rigid posture. But it vanished just as quickly as it had miraculously appeared, instantly replaced by a blank, impenetrable mask of absolute indifference. He smoothly told her that she must be completely mistaken, casually adjusting the crisp cuff of his astronomically expensive suit. Emily's stomach twisted into an agonizing knot of anxiety and confusion. She knew exactly what she had seen with her own 2 eyes. Since she was a little girl, she had perfectly memorized every single microscopic detail of that specific photograph. It was incredibly old, one of the very few that her mother kept hidden away in a small wooden box, alongside other secret keepsakes she rarely ever spoke about. She insisted that she was not mistaken, desperately taking a step closer to the imposing figure. She demanded to know why he had that specific picture. The billionaire slowly exhaled a long breath, acting as if he were deeply pondering whether it was even worth his precious time to address her frantic questioning, before silently turning on his heel and striding purposefully toward the exit. Emily's pulse hammered wildly against her ribs like a trapped bird. She simply could not allow him to vanish into the massive city. This was far too important to let go. She sprinted out from behind the diner counter in a frantic rush, nearly knocking over a tray of dirty coffee cups in the process. She called out to him to wait, her voice thick with raw desperation. He did not stop his brisk pace. With her heart violently pounding in her chest, she chased after him into the freezing, biting evening air of the Chicago streets. The pavement was quiet, save for the distant, muffled hum of city traffic. The billionaire was rapidly approaching a sleek, custom black car parked illegally at the curb. His uniformed chauffeur had already stepped out into the cold to open the heavy rear door for him. Emily finally caught up to him just as he was about to slide into the luxurious vehicle. She begged him to just tell her how he knew her mother, her breath pluming in the freezing air. He paused, his gloved hand resting heavily on the frame of the car door. For one agonizing second, she truly believed that he might actually give her a real answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his cold eyes sweeping over her flushed, desperate face. There was something deeply calculating in his dark gaze, as if he were meticulously trying to decide if she was truly worth a fraction of his time. Then, in a chillingly cold and impersonal tone, he stated that he did not owe her any explanations whatsoever. Those cruel words struck her physically, exactly like a harsh slap to the face. Before she could even attempt to utter another single syllable, he smoothly slid into the dark leather interior of the car, and the chauffeur firmly shut the heavy door behind him. The massive vehicle pulled away from the curb seamlessly, leaving Emily standing alone on the freezing sidewalk, utterly shocked and completely breathless. She had 1,000 burning questions swirling violently in her mind, but only one singular thought continuously echoed loudly in her head. Who exactly was this mysterious man, and what dark secrets was he hiding from her? Emily stood completely paralyzed on the freezing concrete sidewalk, watching helplessly as the sleek black car dissolved into the dark, glittering night of the city. Her heart was still hammering violently against her ribcage, and her breath escaped her lips in short, ragged, freezing gasps. The billionaire's cruel words continuously echoed loudly within the chaotic confines of her mind. He claimed he did not owe her any explanations, but he absolutely did. If he truly possessed a cherished photograph of her beloved mother, there absolutely had to be a significant reason for it, and she was entirely determined to find out exactly what that reason was. She finally forced her frozen body to turn back toward the glowing neon sign of the diner. Her right hand trembled violently as she pushed the heavy glass door open. The familiar chime of the little bell rang above her head, but she barely even registered the sound. The loyal night shift cook, Gary, cast a deeply curious and concerned glance at her through the rectangular kitchen window. He called out over the loud, sizzling noise, asking her if everything was all right, while expertly flipping a greasy burger patty on the hot grill. Emily barely managed to offer him a weak nod as she quickly rushed past him on her way to the employee back room. She desperately needed fresh air, or at least a moment of silence away from the smell of frying onions. She urgently needed to think. She leaned heavily against the cool, unforgiving metal of the tall storage shelves in the cramped pantry. Her mind was racing at absolute top speed, struggling to process the impossible encounter. Her beloved mother had tragically passed away exactly 5 years ago. It had been a massive stroke, unimaginably sudden and unimaginably cruel. It had ripped her away without warning, leaving Emily entirely alone to navigate a harsh, unforgiving world. At the modest funeral, there had been no long-lost wealthy friends or mysterious, powerful figures lingering in the shadows. There had only been a handful of her mother's tired co-workers from the clinic, and a few quiet neighbors from their apartment building. There was absolutely no indication whatsoever that her mother had ever known someone as incredibly powerful and wealthy as the imposing man who had just walked out of her diner. Emily squeezed her eyes tightly shut, desperately trying to control the overwhelming, suffocating wave of intense emotions threatening to drown her. She had always firmly believed that she knew absolutely everything about her mother. But what if she was completely wrong? What if there existed an entire hidden past that her mother had intentionally kept buried? Her tear-filled eyes locked onto her worn canvas purse, resting on the small, scratched table in the dimly lit break room. She practically lunged for it and aggressively pulled out her old, cracked smartphone, frantically typing in searches for billionaire chief executive officers residing in Chicago. It did not take very long at all before she found exactly what she was looking for. His name was Andrew Prescott, the ruthless and brilliant owner of a massive, globally recognized real estate empire. He was a man purportedly worth billions of dollars. Emily stared blankly at his polished corporate photograph on the glowing screen, feeling her empty stomach twist into painful, sickening knots. Why on earth would someone of his immense stature and unimaginable wealth carry a worn photograph of a humble woman who had worked tirelessly as an underpaid nurse in a struggling community clinic? Their two vastly different worlds could not possibly be more polar opposites. An incredibly overwhelming sensation of dread and profound curiosity settled heavily into her chest. She simply had to uncover the ultimate truth. By the time the sun began to rise the following morning, she had made a completely unbreakable decision. She was absolutely not going to sit idly by and allow this haunting mystery to consume her sanity. She desperately needed real answers, and she knew exactly where she had to go to get them. Emily boarded the very first morning bus, heading directly into the heart of downtown Chicago, clutching her worn purse tightly to her chest as she stared blankly out the smudged window. She had spent the entire sleepless night tirelessly digging for information, eventually discovering that the grand headquarters of Andrew Prescott's massive company was located inside one of the tallest, most imposing skyscrapers in the entire city. It was not incredibly far from her neighborhood. She calculated that she could arrive there in less than 20 minutes. The bus rumbled along the icy streets, and a sweet, silver-haired old lady named Martha, who sat in the adjacent seat, offered her a warm, comforting smile, sensing the young woman's immense anxiety. Emily tried to return the smile, but her mind was entirely consumed by a swarm of chaotic questions as the towering, glittering glass skyscraper finally loomed into view. The very second she pushed through the massive revolving doors and stepped inside the grand building, she instantly felt entirely out of place. The cavernous lobby was breathtakingly immense, filled to the brim with sharply dressed, wealthy professionals, who barely even spared her a single passing glance as they rushed by with their expensive coffees. She slowly approached the sleek, modern marble reception desk, desperately trying to calm her severely frayed nerves. The young woman behind the massive counter, named Rachel, was impeccably dressed in a sharp navy blue tailored suit, and she looked up at Emily with a highly polite, but noticeably distant, professional smile. She wished Emily a good morning, and smoothly asked if she possessed a scheduled appointment. Emily's throat instantly went bone dry. She had absolutely no strategic plan. She had no clever excuse prepared. She possessed nothing but a burning, agonizing desire for the truth. She firmly stated that she urgently needed to speak with Andrew Prescott. The receptionist's perfectly practiced smile did not waver for a single second, but the underlying expression in her eyes grew noticeably much colder. She stated with practiced politeness that she was incredibly sorry, but Mr. Prescott absolutely did not accept unannounced visitors under any circumstances, and she repeated her inquiry regarding an appointment. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second. She admitted that she did not have one, but vehemently insisted that it was incredibly important, stressing that it was a highly personal matter. The polished woman's perfectly manicured fingers began to drum lightly, rhythmically upon the cold marble surface of the desk. She explained in a smooth, dismissive tone that Mr. Prescott's incredibly demanding schedule was completely full, offering to redirect Emily to their generic corporate inquiries department if she wished. Emily rapidly interjected, practically begging, stating that she absolutely only needed a few brief minutes of his time. The receptionist simply shook her head with an air of absolute finality. She stated clearly that she was afraid such a request was entirely impossible. Emily's anxious heart sank heavily into her stomach, but she possessed absolutely no intention of simply giving up and walking away. She took a remarkably deep, steadying breath and slowly looked around the bustling, cavernous lobby. She absolutely would not leave this building without the answers she sought, and if she could not possibly gain entry through the normal, polite route, she was absolutely determined to find another, more creative way inside. Emily backed away from the imposing reception desk, forcing her trembling body to project an aura of calm acceptance. She could acutely feel the sharp gaze of the receptionist lingering heavily upon her, fully expecting her to walk out the revolving doors. But Emily had not come this far just to surrender. There absolutely had to be an alternative path into the secure areas of the building. Her sharp eyes rapidly scanned the massive lobby, intensely absorbing every single minute detail of the intricate security setup. Several imposing, broad-shouldered security guards stood firmly planted near the gleaming banks of elevators. Their incredibly sharp, observant eyes constantly scanned the vast room for any signs of trouble. Stressed employees wearing colorful lanyards and plastic identification badges hurriedly rushed in and out of the secure zone, smoothly swiping their electronic cards across the glowing sensors of the tall glass turnstiles. She desperately needed to find a clever method to bypass those secure barriers. Just then, her anxious eyes locked onto a young, slightly disheveled man in a sharp gray suit, balancing a hot cup of coffee in his left hand and tightly gripping a thick leather briefcase under his right arm. He appeared incredibly distracted and highly stressed as he briskly marched toward the secure elevator gates. His entire undivided attention was completely glued to the glowing screen of his smartphone. Without a single second of hesitation, Emily aggressively propelled herself forward, walking at a rapid pace to intercept his path. At the exact precise moment that the distracted employee reached the glowing security checkpoint, Emily leaned in and spoke in a highly confident, incredibly urgent whisper. She told the young man to wait, smoothly claiming that he had entirely forgotten to email her the crucial financial report that Mr. Prescott had explicitly demanded. The young man, whose employee badge read Thomas, looked up at her with an expression of absolute bewilderment. He stammered slightly, utterly confused by the sudden confrontation. Emily immediately shot him a fiercely annoyed, highly impatient glare, praying to every higher power that her impromptu performance sounded deeply convincing. She sternly reminded him that the vital report was strictly due this very morning. Thomas hesitated, his brow furrowing in deep, panicked concentration as he frantically tried to recall the supposed task. As he began to stammer an apology, Emily smoothly and confidently bypassed his frozen form, acting exactly as if she entirely belonged in that high-stakes corporate environment, swiftly slipping straight through the heavy glass turnstile at the exact moment his activated badge triggered the delicate motion sensor. The imposing security guard stationed nearby barely even cast a fleeting glance in her direction. She kept walking at a brisk, purposeful pace, aggressively forcing her tightening lungs to breathe at a normal, steady rhythm. The shiny metal doors of the nearest elevator slid open silently, and she quickly stepped inside the empty cabin, immediately pressing the glowing circular button designated for the highest penthouse floor. Her rapid pulse pounded deafeningly loudly within her ears as the heavy doors finally closed shut, sealing her inside. She had actually managed to do it. The rapid ascent to the top of the skyscraper felt as though it lasted for an absolute eternity. Every single floor that the digital display ticked past only served to exponentially multiply her overwhelming, suffocating anxiety. What on earth was she even going to say when she finally came face to face with the intimidating Andrew Prescott again? Would he instantly command his security team to throw her out onto the street? Would he have her arrested? When the elevator doors eventually glided open, she hesitantly stepped out into a breathtakingly elegant, incredibly modern office space. The massive area featured spectacular floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a truly breathtaking, panoramic view of the sprawling city of Chicago and the dark waters of Lake Michigan. Absolutely everything within the room silently screamed of unimaginable wealth and absolute, unchecked power. Several impeccably dressed assistants sat quietly at their sleek, minimalist desks, rapidly typing away on their silent keyboards. Emily bravely took a single step forward, but before she could make any real progress, a sharp, authoritative voice abruptly halted her in her tracks. A tall, severe-looking man in a dark, perfectly tailored suit approached her rapidly. His name badge identified him as Arthur. His incredibly sharp, deeply critical gaze swept over her simple, inexpensive clothing, immediately accurately assessing her lack of belonging. He firmly stated that she absolutely was not supposed to be up there, and sharply demanded to know if she possessed a confirmed appointment with Mr. Prescott. Emily's dry throat tightened painfully. She could easily have attempted to lie again, but she highly doubted that such a foolish tactic would succeed against this vigilant man. So she did the only remaining thing she possibly could. She told the absolute, undeniable truth. She admitted that she did not have an appointment, but stated fiercely that she absolutely had to see him, declaring that it was regarding her mother. Arthur's stern facial expression did not shift a single millimeter. He coldly stated that Mr. Prescott was currently engaged in a vital meeting. Emily firmly planted her feet and stubbornly declared that she would simply wait. Arthur stared at her intently for a remarkably long time. Then, he let out a heavy sigh, told her to wait exactly where she was, and vanished down a long, opulent corridor. Minutes dragged by in agonizingly slow motion. Suddenly, the massive, heavy oak doors located at the far end of the luxurious office swung open, and Andrew Prescott himself stepped out into the open area. The very second his cold eyes locked onto her trembling form, something entirely unreadable flashed across his stoic facial expression, an incredibly complex emotion that she could not quite successfully identify. But strangely, instead of looking incredibly shocked, fiercely outraged, or aggressively hostile, he merely looked incredibly weary and profoundly resigned. He slowly walked over to where she stood, casually burying his hands deep into the pockets of his expensive trousers. His physical movements were incredibly slow and highly deliberate. He quietly remarked, his voice smooth and low, that she truly was a woman who absolutely never gave up. Emily tightly clenched her trembling hands into tight fists at her sides. She fiercely replied that she would never surrender when it came to matters regarding her mother. An incredibly long, heavy silence rapidly descended upon the room. Finally, the billionaire spoke again. He quietly instructed her to follow him. Without uttering another single syllable, he turned around and slowly walked back toward his massive private office. Emily hesitated for only a fraction of a second, before boldly stepping forward to follow him inside. She was finally going to get the desperately needed answers she had been tirelessly searching for. Emily cautiously stepped inside Andrew Prescott's private sanctuary. The sheer opulence of the massive room completely took her breath away as her wide eyes slowly scanned the luxurious, impeccably designed space. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows completely flooded the entire room with brilliant, golden morning sunlight, and situated perfectly in the absolute center of the room sat a massive, beautifully carved mahogany desk, kept meticulously organized and entirely clear of unnecessary clutter. The towering walls were entirely lined with grand, custom-built bookshelves, completely filled with incredibly expensive, rare, leather-bound volumes. It was unmistakably an office perfectly fit for a powerful man who ruthlessly controlled vast global empires. Andrew slowly walked over to his grand desk and leaned casually against the thick wooden edge, carefully studying her with an incredibly intense, piercing gaze that instantly sent icy shivers racing down her spine. There was something remarkably unreadable and intensely profound hidden within his expression, something incredibly deep and entirely full of conflicting, agonizing emotions. Emily swallowed hard, desperately fighting to reclaim her lost voice, which felt hopelessly trapped inside her throat. She boldly asked him, once again, why he possessed a photograph of her beloved mother. He let out a long, heavy breath, slowly running his large, calloused hand across his tired face. He quietly noted that she was absolutely never going to just let this matter rest in peace, was she? She fiercely and stubbornly replied that she absolutely would not. A heavy, suffocating silence violently filled the tense space between them for several long moments. Then, he slowly reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and carefully pulled out his sleek wallet. Her racing pulse violently accelerated as he incredibly delicately extracted the exact same worn, damaged photograph that she had witnessed the previous night. He held the fragile paper gently between his fingers, staring down at it with an expression of profound sorrow. before slowly turning it around so that she could clearly see it once more. Emily's throat painfully tightened as she gazed upon the familiar image again. It was her mother, looking incredibly young, vibrant, and radiantly happy. But now, as she stared at it much more closely, a glaring detail suddenly caught her undivided attention. It was something she had completely failed to notice in the dim light of the diner. She pointed a trembling finger at the jagged edge of the photograph, where a large section had clearly been aggressively torn away. She stated that the picture was completely incomplete, realizing out loud that there had originally been someone else standing right there beside her. Andrew slowly, solemnly nodded his head in confirmation. He quietly agreed, stating that there was indeed someone incredibly important standing there. Emily's heart began to hammer frantically against her ribs. She demanded to know who it was. For the very first time since they had met, the billionaire's incredibly harsh, intimidating voice noticeably softened. He quietly answered that it was him. Emily instantly felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked right out of her lungs. The grand, sunlit room seemed to violently tilt on its axis, as she stared blankly at the powerful man, desperately trying to mentally process the impossible words he had just spoken. She whispered that what he was saying made absolutely zero sense whatsoever, but as she truly looked at him, deeply examining his face, she finally began to see the hidden truth. There was an incredibly subtle, undeniable resemblance in the structure of his features, and the specific way his sad blue eyes, though deeply hardened by decades of ruthless corporate warfare, carried a familiar spark that she had definitely seen somewhere before. An incredibly agonizing, crushing realization began to slowly settle heavily upon her shoulders. She asked him, her voice barely a fragile whisper, if he had genuinely known her mother. Andrew exhaled a shaky breath, acting exactly as if he had been painfully holding it inside for countless decades. He confessed that he had deeply, passionately loved her. Emily practically stumbled backward, physically retreating from the sheer weight of his shocking confession. She gasped in absolute disbelief. His intense, sorrowful gaze absolutely did not waver from her face. He softly stated that, once upon a time, he and her mother had literally been absolutely everything to one another. Emily's exhausted mind was violently spinning entirely out of control. It was completely, utterly impossible. Her quiet, humble mother had never, ever spoken a single word about him. She had never even briefly mentioned knowing anyone remotely like Andrew Prescott, a ruthless billionaire, a man possessing unimaginable wealth and terrifying power. She furiously shook her head and firmly declared that she absolutely did not believe a single word he was saying. Andrew slowly turned, reached into a locked drawer of his massive desk, and carefully pulled out a small, incredibly old yellowing paper envelope. He gently handed it across the space to her, his warm fingers briefly, accidentally brushing against hers. Emily hesitated for a terrifying moment, and then slowly, cautiously, tore open the fragile seal. Tucked safely inside was a completely different photograph, and this time the picture was entirely whole and undamaged. And there they both were, her beautiful mother, looking incredibly young and absolutely radiant, and standing right beside her was a much younger, incredibly handsome Andrew Prescott. He had his strong arm wrapped protectively and lovingly around her slender waist, and he was smiling in a genuine, carefree manner that Emily could never have possibly imagined him being capable of. Hot, bitter tears violently stung the corners of her eyes. She desperately asked why her mother had never told her the truth. Andrew's strong jaw tightly clenched in obvious pain. He bitterly replied that it was entirely because he had utterly failed to be the honorable man he truly should have been. Emily stared intently at his tortured face, desperately searching for the complete truth. She aggressively demanded to know exactly what had happened to tear them apart. His handsome face grew noticeably darker with profound regret. He confessed that he had made a truly terrible, catastrophic mistake. One single disastrous choice that had completely destroyed everything. Emily gripped the old photograph so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She begged him to just tell her the absolute truth, demanding to hear the entire, unfiltered story. He stared deeply into her eyes for a remarkably long time, acting as if he were meticulously evaluating whether her young heart was truly strong enough to handle the devastating reality. Finally, he spoke again. He stated that it was finally time for her to completely understand who he truly was, and more importantly, who she truly was. Emily's right hand shook uncontrollably as she desperately clutched the photograph. Her sweet mother's smiling face stared happily back at her from the past. The immense, crushing weight of Andrew Prescott's cryptic words settled heavily onto her chest, making it incredibly difficult for her to draw a full breath. This intimidating man, this incredibly powerful billionaire, was fundamentally tied to her family's secret past in a highly intimate way that she could never have possibly anticipated. And right now, he was about to reveal something that held the power to completely shatter her entire reality. She forced herself to bravely look directly into his sad blue eyes. She demanded to know who she was. Andrew hesitated, looking physically pained. His jaw muscles clenched tightly as he seemingly gathered every ounce of his emotional strength. Then, he drew a massive, shuddering breath into his lungs and plainly stated that she was his biological daughter. Those incredible words struck her physical body with the devastating force of a massive lightning bolt falling from a clear blue sky. The luxurious office completely spun around her, and a deafening, high-pitched ringing noise violently erupted in her ears. She frantically shook her head, stumbling blindly backwards away from the desk. She cried out that it was entirely impossible, a complete lie. Andrew's voice was remarkably steady, yet it carried an incredibly deep, undeniable undercurrent of absolute agony. He sorrowfully insisted that it was the truth, revealing that he had known about her existence for several long years, Emily. He admitted that he knew the absolute, undeniable truth the very second he laid eyes upon her face in that run-down diner, because she looked exactly, perfectly, like the woman he had loved. Her overwhelmed mind was completely reeling. Her mother had absolutely never even briefly hinted at such a massive secret, not even a single time. She angrily accused him of being a liar. He simply shook his head in defeat and softly whispered that he truly wished he was lying to her. Emily genuinely felt her weak knees beginning to buckle and violently give way beneath her, but she absolutely refused to allow herself to collapse onto the floor in front of this man. She furiously demanded to know that if this insane story was actually the truth, why had her mother never told her? Why had he never even bothered to try and find her? Andrew slowly, painfully let out a ragged breath. He tragically confessed that it was because he had completely failed her mother. He admitted that he had miserably failed both of them. His broad chest physically heaved with the heavy burden of his guilt. She demanded to know exactly what terrible thing he had done. He forcefully dragged his hand across his pale face, his expression completely tortured by old ghosts. He explained that he and her mother had been deeply, passionately in love. They had been incredibly young and wonderfully reckless, but he had also been blindly, foolishly ambitious. He desperately desired vastly more corporate power, incredible success, and unimaginable amounts of money. His extremely wealthy, aristocratic family had been violently opposed to their relationship. They had explicitly threatened that if he stubbornly chose to remain with her mother, they would maliciously strip him of absolutely everything he stood to inherit. And, exactly like a pathetic, greedy coward, he had actually listened to their cruel threats. Emily gasped sharply, struggling for air. He confessed that he had simply walked away. His voice was completely broken, barely a harsh whisper. He admitted that he had abandoned her exactly when she had needed his support the absolute most. He foolishly believed that he was making the most logical, practical decision at the time. He naively thought that he would simply be able to return to her much later, after he had successfully built the massive, powerful life that he selfishly desired. But by the time he finally woke up and fully realized the horrible magnitude of the catastrophic mistake he had made, it was far too late. She had completely vanished without a single trace. Emily's vision became entirely blurred by a thick veil of unshed, angry tears. She stated with venom in her voice that her mother had run away specifically because of him and his cowardice. Andrew slowly nodded his heavy head, his handsome face completely etched with profound, irreversible sorrow. He explained that he had spent countless years utilizing all his vast resources, trying desperately to locate her, but she absolutely did not want to be found by him. She fiercely wanted to protect Emily from him, and from the utterly ruthless, cold and calculating life that he had chosen to build for himself. Emily's throat tightened to the point of genuine physical pain. She spat out the words, accusing him of completely abandoning the woman he supposedly loved, and abandoning his own flesh and blood. His dark blue eyes clouded over with immense, agonizing pain. He softly agreed, admitting his absolute guilt, and he confessed that he had spent absolutely every single day of his incredibly wealthy, empty life, bitterly regretting that unforgivable choice. An incredibly long, suffocatingly heavy silence completely filled the massive room. The charged air suspended between them felt incredibly dense, weighed down by the massive burden of countless unspoken truths and decades of silent suffering. Emily tightly clenched her shaking hands into white-knuckled fists. A violent, chaotic war of conflicting emotions raged furiously within her soul. For her entire life, she had fought tooth and nail just to survive. She had agonizingly watched her exhausted mother literally work herself into an early grave, desperately trying to provide basic food and shelter for them. And throughout all those years of immense suffering, Andrew Prescott had been comfortably living in absolute, unimaginable luxury, never truly experiencing a single fraction of the grueling pain and agonizing desperation that they had bravely endured. Emily struggled to contain her overwhelming emotions as she confronted Andrew, the father she had never known. Instead of screaming, she asked why he had chosen to reveal the truth now. Andrew admitted he could not bear to lose her after already losing her mother, and begged for a second chance. Emily, stunned to discover that the billionaire standing before her was the man who had abandoned the woman he loved, questioned how he could expect forgiveness after years of absence and suffering. Andrew acknowledged that he could never erase the pain he had caused or repair the past. He insisted he was not trying to buy her forgiveness with money, but simply wanted the opportunity to make things right. He revealed that he had never known Emily existed, that she had never been unwanted, and that he would have loved and protected her if he had been given the chance. Although Emily still carried deep anger, she recognized the genuine grief and regret in his voice, and began to see a broken man, rather than the selfish young man who had once walked away. Emily admitted she did not know whether she could ever forgive him, and Andrew promised to spend the rest of his life earning her trust. He then gave her a velvet box that her mother had left for her years earlier. Inside was a silver necklace engraved with the words, "Forgive, love, begin." Holding the necklace, Emily remembered her mother's belief that forgiveness is an act of strength, not weakness, and that healing is possible despite painful betrayal. She realized that while the past could never be changed, it did not have to define the future, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope for a new beginning.